If you think retail customers are bad, wait until you see what walks into a pawn shop. We are talking about people demanding thousands for broken lawnmowers, guys trying to pawn half-eaten beef jerky, and customers calling the cops because a store would not buy their pet rock. These are the 69 most delusional, entitled, and absolutely insane complaints from the world of pawnbroking. 1. So there's this guy who walks into a pawn shop in Houston with a grocery bag full of old TV remotes. Not one or two. 17 remotes. He wants $40 for the whole collection and gets genuinely offended when the clerk offers him nothing. His argument? Every single one of these works. Cool, but they're remotes to TVs nobody owns anymore. When the clerk suggested he try a garage sale instead, the man demanded to speak with the owner and filed a formal complaint, saying the shop was devaluing consumer electronics. Sir, your Zenith remote from 1993 is not a consumer electronic. It's a museum piece at best. 2. Picture this. A woman in Phoenix drops off her gold bracelet at a pawn shop, takes out a small loan against it, and then calls the shop every single day for 2 weeks straight to ask if her bracelet is okay. Not whether her payment is due. Not about the loan terms. She wanted to know if the bracelet was being stored properly, if anyone was touching it, and whether it was in a temperature-controlled environment. She eventually filed a complaint with the city because, and this is a direct quote from the report, the shop was emotionally neglecting her jewelry. 3. Nothing says rock bottom quite like trying to pawn your own CPAP machine. A guy in Tennessee actually unhooked himself from his sleep apnea device, drove to the nearest pawn shop, and asked for $150. The pawnbroker told him they don't accept medical equipment. The customer threw a fit, claiming it was basically the same as a vacuum cleaner, and the shop had no right to discriminate against health-related merchandise. He left a 1-star review that night, calling the place anti-medical, and said he'd be contacting the American Medical Association about a pawn shop in Knoxville. 4. A couple in Detroit brought in a flat-screen TV they'd bought from that very same shop 2 years earlier. They wanted a full refund, not store credit, not an exchange, a complete refund, with the original receipt they definitely did not have. Their reasoning was that the TV had stopped being fun to watch, and they felt the shop should stand behind its products long-term. The employee asked if the TV was broken. Nope, worked perfectly. They were just bored of it. When told that's not how pawn shops work, the husband looked the clerk dead in the eye and said, "This is why Amazon is winning." 5. Somebody in Albuquerque once called the cops on a pawn shop because they refused to buy his collection of autographed napkins. He claimed every napkin was signed by a different celebrity. No certificates of authenticity, no photos of the signings. Just a gallon-size Ziploc bag full of wrinkled napkins with illegible scribbles on them. The police showed up, heard the man's case, and politely told him this was a civil matter. He then pivoted and accused the pawn shop of suppressing the memorabilia market. The officer's report allegedly described the complaint as a disagreement over napkins. 6. Here's one that pawn shop employees say happens way more than you'd think. A guy brings in an item, gets told it's worth about $20, and immediately pulls up a screenshot of some random eBay listing where the same item is priced at $300. Listed. Not sold. Just listed. There's a massive difference between what someone hopes to get and what anyone is actually willing to pay, but try explaining that to a man holding his phone like it's a court order. One shop in Georgia said they get this at least 5 times a week, and every single time the customer acts like they just caught the pawnbroker committing a federal crime. 7. A woman brought her Chihuahua into a pawn shop in Las Vegas and asked how much she could get for him. Not as a joke. She put the dog on the counter like it was a vintage watch. The employee, completely caught off guard, told her they don't accept living things. She got upset, pointed at a taxidermy deer head mounted on the wall and said, "You accept animals, just not live ones? That's backwards." Honestly, as far as pawnshop logic goes, she almost had a point. Almost. She did not get any money for the Chihuahua and reportedly called the shop later that evening to ask if they'd changed their mind. 8. This one is legendary among pawnbrokers. A man in Florida sold a guitar to a pawn shop for $80. Fair deal. Everyone was happy. 3 days later, he came back, saw his guitar on the shelf priced at $160, and completely lost his mind. He demanded either the guitar back for free or the extra $80 in profit sharing. Profit sharing from a pawn shop. He argued that since it was his guitar, he was entitled to a percentage of the markup. When the manager stopped laughing long enough to say no, the man threatened to sue for unauthorized resale of his intellectual property. It was a used Fender Squier. 9. At a shop outside of Atlanta, a customer returned a power drill he had purchased the day before and demanded a refund because, and he was dead serious, it drills to the right. That is what drills do. They turn clockwise. That is the entire function of a drill. The employee tried to explain this. The customer wasn't having it. He insisted that his old drill spun the other way, which means either his old drill was broken or he'd been putting in screws backwards for years. Both options are equally incredible. He never got the refund, but he did leave a review calling the shop a hazard to home improvement. 10. One of the all-time greatest pawnshop complaints came from a man who pawned his prosthetic leg for cash, then came back a week later hobbling on crutches, furious that the shop had actually kept it. That was the deal, sir. That is literally what pawning means. You give them something, they give you money, and you pay it back to get the thing returned. He somehow expected them to just hold on to it as a courtesy while he used the cash. When the employee reminded him of the loan terms he signed, the man said he thought the paperwork was just a formality. He did eventually pay off the loan and get the leg back, but not before calling the local news station to report what he described as legalized limb theft. 11. You know what no pawn shop has ever wanted to buy? A jar of toenail clippings. But that didn't stop a man in Oklahoma City from trying. He claimed he'd been collecting them for over a decade and that the jar weighed nearly 2 pounds. As if weight determines value. The clerk didn't even touch the jar, just pointed at the door. The customer left a voicemail later that day asking if the shop would reconsider if he organized them by year. 12. A woman in Sacramento bought a used laptop from a pawn shop, came back a week later, and complained that it didn't have Microsoft Office installed. She wanted the shop to either install it for free or refund her money entirely. The employee explained they sell hardware, not software licenses. She stared at him for a solid 5 seconds and said, "So you sold me a computer that can't even type?" "Ma'am, it can type." Notepad exists. She was not interested in hearing about Notepad. 13. There's a pawn shop in Milwaukee where a guy tried to return a pair of Jordans because they didn't make him faster. Not defective, not the wrong size. He just genuinely expected a physical performance boost from a pair of used sneakers. He said his cousin told him Jordans add at least 2 inches to your vertical leap, and he wanted his money back because it was false advertising. The shop didn't advertise anything. They put shoes on a shelf. That was the extent of their marketing campaign. 14. A man pawned his wedding ring on a Monday, then showed up on Wednesday with his wife, who had no idea the ring was gone. She spotted it in the display case, in front of the employees, in front of other customers. What followed was not a complaint to the shop, but a full-blown domestic argument right there between the glass cases of used electronics and power tools. The staff just watched. Nobody intervened. The wife eventually bought the ring back herself and walked out without saying a word to her husband, who was still standing at the counter looking like his soul had left his body. 15. Some guy drove 45 minutes to a pawn shop in rural Missouri to sell a riding lawnmower that didn't start. Wouldn't even turn over. The shop offered him $20 for parts. He wanted $600. His logic? I paid $1,200 for it new. Yeah, 7 years ago. And it worked back then. He spent 20 minutes arguing, then asked to speak with the district manager, which is not a thing pawn shops have. When told there was no such person, he demanded to see Whoever's above you. The only person above the clerk was God. And he wasn't making offers on broken lawnmowers either. 16. At a pawn shop in Tampa, a woman asked if she could pawn her timeshare. Not paperwork related to a timeshare, the actual concept of partial vacation property ownership. She didn't bring a deed. She didn't bring documents. She just walked in and said, "I own 2 weeks in Cancun. How much can I get?" The pawnbroker's face apparently went through 4 different emotions in about 2 seconds. She was politely told that's not how any of this works. She asked if they could at least hold her 2 weeks as collateral. 17. A customer in St. Louis bought a used microwave from a pawn shop for $15. He returned the next day saying it made his burrito taste weird. Not that it didn't heat properly, not that it sparked or smoked. The burrito simply did not meet his flavor expectations, and the microwave was apparently to blame. The employee asked what kind of burrito it was. Gas station. The microwave was not the problem. The customer disagreed and spent the next 10 minutes explaining his theory about radiation flavor contamination before finally leaving. 18. There was a man in Tucson who came in with a cardboard box full of rocks. Regular rocks. From his backyard. He said they were desert minerals and claimed a geologist friend had valued the collection at $500. The pawnbroker picked one up, looked at it, and set it back down. Just a rock. The man pulled out a handwritten note on notebook paper that said, "Certified geological specimens," as proof of authenticity. No letterhead, no signature from any actual professional, just his own handwriting. He complained to the Better Business Bureau the following week. 19. A woman in Baltimore pawned her television, came back 2 months after the loan expired, and was furious that the shop had sold it. She screamed at the staff for 20 minutes straight, called it theft, called it a scam, demanded police involvement. The officers arrived, read through the signed agreement she herself had put her name on, and explained that her loan defaulted 60 days ago. Her response? "I didn't think you'd actually sell it. Nobody wants a 40-inch TV. Somebody did, because it was gone within a week of hitting the shelf." 20. At a pawn shop in Denver, a man tried to sell a half-used bottle of cologne. Not a vintage bottle, not a discontinued collector's item, a department store cologne that was maybe 60% full. When the clerk said they couldn't accept it, the man sprayed it on his wrist, held it up to the clerk's face, and said, "Smell that and tell me that's not worth $20. The clerk did not smell it. The clerk asked him to leave. He went home and left a review saying the staff had no nose for value. 21. Some dude walked into a pawn shop in Indianapolis carrying a full-size car stereo still dangling its cut wires. Not removed properly. Cut. As in recently ripped out of a dashboard in what definitely looked like a hurry. The clerk asked if he had proof of ownership. The man said, "It came from my car." The clerk asked which car. The man said he'd rather not say. That's usually where the conversation ends and the police conversation begins. He left very quickly when the clerk reached for the phone. 22. A woman in San Antonio brought in a bag of designer purses that were so obviously fake, the logos were misspelled. One said Gucci, another said Louis Vuitton. She wanted $300 for the lot and got offended when the clerk pointed out the spelling errors. She said, "That's the European version." There is no European version of the word Gucci that drops a C. She accused the shop of not understanding fashion and said she'd take her business to a more cultured establishment. She then walked across the street to another pawn shop. 23. A pawn shop in Chicago had a customer who tried to pawn his gym membership card. Not sell the membership. Pawn the physical card itself, like a laminated piece of plastic with his photo on it was collateral for anything. The clerk told him the card had no resale value. The customer argued that the membership cost him $40 a month, and he'd been a member for 3 years, so mathematically, the card represented over $1,400 in investment. That's not how math works. That's not how pawn shops work. That's not how anything works. 24. Here's a complaint that went semi-viral in pawnbroker circles online. A man in Virginia bought a used guitar from a pawn shop, took it home, and called the shop to complain that it didn't come with songs on it. He thought it would have music preloaded, like a playlist, on an acoustic guitar. The clerk was speechless for so long the man actually asked if the call had dropped. When told guitars require a human being to physically play them, he asked if the shop offered lessons. They did not. He asked for a refund, also no. 25. Nothing kills the vibe at a pawn shop faster than a customer walking in with a live animal, and apparently it happens constantly. A guy in Memphis showed up with a ball python wrapped around his arm and asked for $50. The clerk said no to the snake and also asked him to remove it from the store. The man complained that this was species discrimination and said if the shop accepted leather belts, they should accept snakes too because it's basically the same material. That sentence will live rent-free in that clerk's head forever. 26. A customer at a pawn shop in Portland returned a used vacuum cleaner the same day he bought it. His complaint was that it worked too well. He said it sucked up a small Lego piece his kid left on the floor, and now the Lego was stuck somewhere inside the machine. He didn't want a refund. He wanted the pawn shop to disassemble the vacuum, retrieve the Lego piece, and reassemble it for a $2 toy inside a $20 vacuum. The clerk offered him a screwdriver so he could do it himself. He declined and said that wasn't customer service. 27. There was a man in Baton Rouge who walked into a pawn shop, browsed the jewelry case for an hour, then complained to the manager that nothing in the store was nice enough for his wife. He didn't buy anything. He didn't try to sell anything. He just wanted the staff to know that their inventory was beneath his standards. He then asked if they could order something specific for him, like this was a Tiffany catalog service. The manager said no. The man said he was disappointed in the direction the store was heading. He had never been there before. 28. At a shop in Columbus, Ohio, a woman tried to pawn a half-finished jigsaw puzzle. Not the full box. Just the assembled portion, glued to a piece of cardboard with roughly 40% of the image missing. She called it art. The clerk called it a puzzle with no box and no missing pieces to complete it. She argued it had abstract value and that unfinished art sells for thousands in galleries. She wanted $75. She was offered $0. She said she'd find a buyer who appreciates vision. 29. Some guy in Phoenix complained that the pawn shop sold him a watch that runs too fast. Not broken, not stuck. He claimed the watch gained about 2 minutes per day and accused the shop of selling defective merchandise. The employee offered to adjust it. The man didn't want it adjusted. He wanted a full refund and a written apology for wasting his time. Literally, wasting his time. With a watch that ran fast, he either didn't catch the irony or chose to ignore it completely. Either way, the clerk had to walk into the back room for a minute just to collect himself. 30. A woman in New Orleans pawned her laptop, then called the pawn shop demanding they not look through her files while they had it. She called 3 times in one day. The staff told her each time that nobody was going through her personal data. She didn't believe them and showed up in person to demand they sign a non-disclosure agreement she had printed off the internet. A full NDA. For a $200 pawn loan on a 5-year-old HP laptop. The staff declined to sign it. She threatened legal action and said she had very sensitive spreadsheets on there. Nobody wanted to know what that meant. 31. A teenager in Dallas tried to pawn a school textbook. Not a rare first edition. A standard biology textbook with the school's name still stamped inside the front cover. The clerk told him they couldn't accept it because it was clearly school property. The kid argued that since his parents paid taxes, the textbook technically belonged to his family. That's a creative interpretation of public education funding, but it didn't fly. He then asked if they'd take it without the cover, as if removing the school stamp made it legal. It did not. He left with the book still under his arm. 32. A customer at a shop in Omaha brought in a treadmill that was missing the belt. So essentially, he brought in a metal frame with a motor and a digital screen. No walking surface. He wanted $200 for it. When the clerk asked where the belt was, the man shrugged and said his dog chewed through it. He then insisted the electronics alone were worth his asking price. The clerk offered $20. The customer acted like he'd been personally insulted, said the shop was predatory, and threatened to report them to the Federal Trade Commission over a beltless treadmill. 33. At a shop in Reno, a guy tried to pawn a set of snow tires in the middle of July. Totally bald. No tread left at all. He wanted $150 for the set. The clerk told him they were essentially worthless because they had no grip left. The customer's response was, "They still hold air." Which is technically true, but that's like saying a pen with no ink is still a pen. He left the tires leaning against the building and never came back. The shop eventually had to pay to have them hauled away, which means the tires actually cost them money. 34. There's a recurring complaint type that drives every pawnbroker insane. Someone brings in a broken item, openly admits it doesn't work, then gets furious when the offer is low. A man in Kansas City brought in a completely dead chainsaw. Wouldn't start, blade was dull, housing was cracked. He wanted $200. When offered $15, he said, "You're out of your mind. You know how much steel chainsaws cost new?" Yeah, new, functioning, with all their parts intact. This one was basically a dangerous paperweight with a pull cord. 35. A woman in Jacksonville complained that a pawnshop engagement ring her boyfriend gave her was bad luck. She said she'd gotten 2 flat tires, lost her job, and her cat ran away all within a month of wearing it. She came in demanding a refund on what she called a cursed ring. The clerk tried to explain that pawnshops don't offer refunds based on supernatural events. She asked if they had any rings that came with positive energy. They did not have a positive energy section. She bought a different ring anyway and asked for a written guarantee that this one wouldn't curse her. 36. A man walked into a shop in Little Rock with a box of VHS tapes and asked for $10 each. The clerk said they hadn't accepted VHS tapes since roughly 2005. The customer looked personally betrayed, pointed at a DVD player on the shelf and said, "If you sell those, you should sell these too. It's the same thing." It is absolutely not the same thing. He then launched into a speech about how vinyl records made a comeback, so VHS was next. He's still waiting for that comeback. We all are. 37. At a pawnshop in Fresno, a woman tried to return a necklace she'd bought for her daughter's birthday because her daughter didn't like it. This was 3 months after the purchase. No receipt. The necklace had clearly been worn extensively because the clasp was bent and the chain was tarnished. When told the shop doesn't do returns, especially not after 90 days in visible wear, she said, "Walmart takes everything back." "Ma'am, this is not Walmart. This is a building with bars on the windows that buys used power tools. Different business model entirely." 38. Here's one from a shop in Savannah. A man tried to pawn a bag of sand. Not decorative sand, not sand from some historic location. Regular sand. In a Ziploc bag. His claim was that it came from a beach where a famous movie was filmed and was therefore a collectible. He couldn't name the movie. He couldn't name the beach. He just had sand and confidence. When turned away, he asked if the shop would reconsider if he brought documentation. What documentation exists for a handful of sand? A certificate from the ocean? 39. A guy in Pittsburgh bought a used PlayStation from a pawn shop and returned the next day demanding his money back because the console didn't come with any games. The clerk explained that games are sold separately and always have been. The man said, "At GameStop, they give you a bundle deal." This isn't GameStop. This is a pawn shop where someone traded their PlayStation to pay a light bill. There's no bundle. There's no loyalty program. There's no rewards points. Just a console and a receipt. He left a review calling the experience incomplete. 40. A woman brought a fur coat into a pawn shop in Detroit during a heat wave in August. The coat smelled like mothballs and had a small tear in the lining. She wanted $500. The clerk offered $60. She gasped like she'd been slapped. She then said the coat was originally purchased in 1987 for $2,000, and that fur only goes up in value. It does not. Especially not fur that smells like your grandmother's closet and has a hole in it. She stormed out saying she'd rather donate it than be disrespected like this. 41. At a shop in Topeka, a customer complained that the used bicycle he bought had a squeaky chain. He didn't bring it back to ask for help or lubricant. He brought it back to demand a full refund for selling a defective vehicle. He called it a vehicle. He then compared the situation to buying a car with engine problems and said the shop should be held to automotive standards. The clerk offered him a can of WD-40 for $2. The man said accepting that would be admitting the bike was flawed at the time of sale, and he refused on legal grounds. 42. There's a pawn shop in El Paso where a man once complained that the employees spoke Spanish to each other behind the counter. Not to him. To each other. He said it was suspicious and implied they were discussing how to rip him off. Sir, this is El Paso. 80% of the city speaks Spanish. They were probably talking about lunch. He filed a complaint with the city and reportedly described the experience as an unwelcoming retail environment. The shop framed that complaint and hung it on the wall. 43. A man in Mobile, Alabama walked in with a set of golf clubs so rusted the shafts were flaking. He wanted $400 because they were vintage Callaways. The clerk picked one up and a chunk of rust literally fell onto the counter. The man said, "That's patina. It adds character." Patina is for copper roofs and antique furniture. It is not for golf clubs that could give you tetanus on the back nine. He argued for 15 minutes, used the word patina 11 times, and eventually left after the shop offered him $30 for the bag alone. 44. A customer in Rapid City, South Dakota, returned a used microphone to a pawn shop and said it made her voice sound bad. The clerk asked her to elaborate. She said she recorded herself singing, and the playback sounded nothing like what she heard in her head. That's not a microphone problem. That's a every human being on Earth problem. Your voice always sounds different recorded. The microphone was working exactly as intended. She wanted a refund anyway. When denied, she said the shop should at least warn people that microphones do that. 45. A couple in Lexington, Kentucky brought in matching recliner chairs and were furious when the shop said they didn't accept furniture. The husband got so worked up, he sat down in one of the recliners right there in the middle of the store and said he wasn't leaving until they made an offer. He actually reclined it, kicked the footrest up and everything. His wife stood next to him with her arms crossed like a bodyguard. They sat there for about 20 minutes before the clerk finally called the police, who arrived to find a grown man fully reclined between the guitar rack and the tool shelf. 46. A guy rushed into a pawn shop in Detroit with a PlayStation 5, looking very nervous and asking for quick cash. The console was in perfect condition. But when the clerk plugged it in to test it, a bright blue screen popped up asking for a 4-digit parental control PIN. The man claimed he set it himself but forgot the numbers because of stress. The hint question on the screen read, "What is mommy's favorite color?" The clerk read it out loud. The man grabbed the console, didn't say a word, and sprinted out the door. 47. At a shop in Richmond, a woman complained that a diamond ring she bought turned her finger green. Except it wasn't sold as a diamond. The tag said cubic zirconia in clear letters. The band was stainless steel. She paid $19 for it. She still showed up with printed articles about nickel allergies and demanded the shop cover her dermatologist visit, which cost more than the ring itself. She said she was going to take this all the way and hire a lawyer. Over a $19 ring from a pawn shop. Somewhere, an attorney laughed and hung up the phone. 48. A man in Spokane tried to pawn his work uniform. Polo shirt, khaki pants, name tag still attached. He said the uniform was company property worth at least $100. The clerk told him they don't buy used clothing, and also, pawning your employer's property is generally not a great career move. The man said he was quitting the next day anyway, so it didn't matter. He also tried to throw in a lanyard and a security badge as a package deal. The total offer remained zero. 49. At a pawn shop in Fort Worth, a woman bought a used Kindle for $20, came back 2 days later, and complained that none of the previous owner's books were still on it. She said she specifically bought it because she saw books on the screen in the store. The staff had factory reset the device before selling it, as they do with all electronics. She was livid. She said those books were the whole reason she bought it and demanded either the books back or a refund. The clerk explained they had no way to recover a stranger's Amazon account. She called it a bait and switch. 50. A customer in Birmingham tried to pawn a broken air conditioner window unit in the middle of January. Nobody is buying a broken air conditioner in winter. Nobody is buying a broken air conditioner in summer either. But at least you could argue there's urgency. The clerk said it wasn't worth anything. The man said, "Summer's coming." It was 4 months away. He asked the shop to hold it as an investment pawn until demand went up. That is not a financial instrument pawn shop's offer. He said he'd be back in June. He was not back in June. 51. A woman in Hartford filed an actual police report against a pawn shop because they sold a necklace she had been thinking about buying. She came in on a Tuesday, looked at it, said she'd come back Friday. Friday comes, necklace is gone. Someone else bought it. That's how stores work. First come, first served. She told the officers the shop had a moral obligation to hold items for interested customers. The cops had to explain that browsing is not a legally binding reservation. She then asked if she could press charges against the person who bought it. 52. A man at a shop in Chattanooga brought in a taxidermy squirrel dressed in a tiny cowboy outfit. Hat, vest, little boots. He wanted $75 and said it was a one-of-a-kind folk art piece. The clerk said it was a dead squirrel in a costume. The man got emotional about it and said he'd spent hours on the outfit. That actually made it sadder. He eventually lowered his price to $20, then $10, then offered to leave it on consignment. The shop declined all options. The squirrel cowboy went home with its creator, dignity intact. 53. At a pawn shop in Salt Lake City, a customer bought a used electric keyboard and returned it because it only played in English. The clerk had no idea what that meant. Turns out the man expected the keyboard to have settings for different languages, as in, he thought pressing a key would produce musical notes that somehow sounded Chinese or French. That is not how music works. Notes don't have nationalities. When this was explained, he looked skeptical and said, "Then why do they call it world music?" He kept the keyboard but was clearly not satisfied. 54. Here's one from Shreveport. A guy walked in and asked a pawn shop to appraise his tattoo. Not a painting. Not a sketch. A tattoo on his forearm. He rolled up his sleeve and asked what the shop thought it was worth. The clerk told him they can't buy something that's permanently attached to a human body. The man was confused by this and pointed out that the tattoo cost him $300, so it should have resale value. He then asked if the shop would consider leasing his arm for display purposes. That was a real sentence that came out of a real person's mouth. 55. A woman in Minneapolis returned a pair of earrings to a pawn shop and said they were too heavy. They were small gold studs. They weighed almost nothing. When the clerk put them on a scale to prove it, she said, "I don't mean physically heavy, I mean energetically heavy." She explained she was sensitive to the energy of previous owners, and these earrings were giving her headaches. The clerk asked if she wanted to exchange them. She said only if the replacement pair had been cleansed. The shop did not have a spiritual cleansing station. She left without the earrings or a refund. 56. A man in Anchorage pawned his snowblower in March, which makes sense because winter was ending. He came back in October when the first snowfall hit and was outraged that the shop had sold it. His loan had expired 5 months earlier. He never made a single payment. He said the shop should have known he'd want it back when winter came and held it for him out of common sense. The clerk said common sense would have been making your payments. The man stood in the doorway for a while, watching the snow fall, then quietly left. 57. At a shop in Nashville, a guy tried to sell a guitar pick that he claimed was used by Johnny Cash at a concert in 1969. No proof whatsoever. Just a regular black guitar pick in a sandwich bag. When asked how he could verify the claim, he said, "My dad was there and he caught it." His dad was not present to confirm this. There was no ticket stub, no photo, no nothing. Just a man, a pick, and a dream. The shop offered him nothing. He said they had no respect for music history and left looking personally wounded. 58. At a shop in Cleveland, a customer tried to pawn a katana he bought at a mall kiosk. He wanted $2,000 because he claimed it was ancient folded steel from the Edo period. The clerk pointed to the stamp near the handle that clearly said, "Stainless China." The customer argued that the stamp was put there by a museum curator to protect its identity from thieves. He was dead serious. He refused to accept that his ancient artifact was mass-produced in 2010. 59. A woman at a pawn shop in Tulsa tried to haggle the price on her own pawn loan. Not the price of an item, the interest rate on her loan. She wanted the clerk to lower the rate because she'd been a loyal customer for years. Pawn loan rates are set by state law. The clerk can't just change them because you're a regular. She said every other business rewards loyalty and asked where her pawn shop frequent borrower discount was. It doesn't exist. She suggested they create one. The clerk said he'd pass it along. He did not pass it along. 60. A man in Buffalo brought a vacuum-sealed bag of beef jerky into a pawn shop and asked what they'd give him for it. Homemade beef jerky, in an unlabeled bag. The clerk said they don't accept food. The man said it wasn't food, it was artisanal protein, and that he sold it at flea markets for $15 a bag. The clerk still said no. The man opened the bag right there in the store, pulled out a piece, ate it, and said, "Your loss." The shop smelled like smoked meat for the rest of the afternoon. 61. At a pawn shop in Billings, Montana, a customer complained that a used toolbox he bought didn't come with tools, just the box, empty. He said the display model in the store had tools in it, and he assumed they were included. They were not included. They were other merchandise sitting inside a toolbox for display purposes. Every tool had its own individual price tag. He said the presentation was misleading and compared it to buying a house and finding out the furniture doesn't come with it. Which is actually exactly how buying a house works, so he accidentally made the point against himself. 62. A woman showed up at a pawn shop in Boise, carrying 3 bags of used baby clothes and asking for $200. The shop doesn't buy clothing of any kind, but especially not onesies with spit-up stains. When informed of this, she said, "These are Carter's brand. Do you know how expensive Carter's is? Carter's is known for being affordable. That's literally the whole appeal." She argued for several minutes, citing retail prices, and at one point pulled out a specific onesie and said, "This one alone was $14. Was, past tense. It's worth about a quarter now. She left but promised to write about this online. 63. Some guy in Louisville tried to pawn a half-rack of Bud Light. 12 cans, room temperature. He said he bought a 24-pack, drank half, and wanted to recoup some of the cost. The clerk told him this was a pawn shop, not a recycling center, and definitely not a liquor store. The man argued that the cans were still sealed and had value. Which, sure, at a gas station, not at a store that deals in jewelry and electronics. He asked if he could at least trade the beer for something small. The clerk said no, and the man left the cans on the counter. They were still there at closing. 64. A woman in Seattle brought in a plastic bag full of loose pills. Different colors, shapes, sizes, all mixed together like trail mix. She poured them onto the counter and asked for an appraisal. When the clerk immediately backed away and said they don't buy medication, she got offended. She claimed it was over-the-counter stuff and that she was just trying to help someone stock their medicine cabinet. She threatened to report the shop to the health department for denying access to health care. The clerk was already dialing the non-emergency line. 65. A customer at a shop in Syracuse complained that a gold chain he bought had turned a slightly different shade after a week of wear. Not green, not discolored, just a marginally different hue of gold. He brought a magnifying glass and a printout of the original listing photo to prove it. The clerk looked at both and saw zero difference. 2 other employees were called over. They also saw nothing. The man insisted the gold was fading and demanded a metallurgical analysis. He wanted the pawn shop to send his $15 chain to a lab. 66. A woman in Pensacola came into a pawn shop and complained that she could hear a ticking sound coming from a watch in the display case, and it was giving her anxiety. She hadn't bought anything. She was just browsing. She asked the clerk to either remove the watch or put it somewhere she couldn't hear it. The clerk pointed out that watches tick. That is what they do. She said the shop should sell digital watches instead because they're quieter and more considerate. She browsed for another 20 minutes, bought nothing, and left. 67. A man in Lubbock tried to pawn a framed photo of himself. Professional headshot, nice frame, decent lighting. He said the frame alone was worth $30. The clerk said maybe, but they couldn't sell a framed photo of a random stranger. The man took offense to being called a stranger and said he was well known in the community. He was not well known to anyone in the shop. He asked if removing his photo and selling just the frame was an option. The clerk said, sure, for about $3. The man put his headshot back under his arm and walked out looking deeply undervalued. 68. At a pawn shop in Fargo, a customer returned a space heater in April and wanted a full refund because the weather got warmer. That was his complaint. The seasons changed. Spring arrived, as it does every single year, and he no longer needed the heater. He felt the shop should take it back since the product was, in his words, no longer relevant. The clerk explained that seasonal changes don't qualify as a return reason. The man said, "You wouldn't sell someone an umbrella on a sunny day." Actually, you would, because rain exists. He left with the heater. 69. And finally, the king of all pawn shop complaints. A man in Miami walked into a pawn shop, sold his TV for $70, walked out to his car, sat there for 3 minutes, walked back in, and tried to buy the TV back for $50. When told it was now priced at $140, he lost it. He accused the shop of flipping his property for profit. That is literally the entire business model of a pawn shop. That's the whole thing. Buy low, sell higher. He said he was going to start his own pawn shop where customers come first. As far as anyone knows, that shop has not opened yet. That concludes our tour of delusional economics. Now be honest. Look around your room right now. What is the one item you own that you swear is valuable, but deep down, you know a pawn shop would not even give you $1 for? Tell me about your most worthless treasure in the comments. If this reality check entertained you, hit that like button and subscribe for the next round.